Welcome to Football versus Football. On today's episode, John Pranjic of the 3four3 podcast.
I was thinking like, oh, these guys from FC Barcelona are going to be, at this park in downtown LA. I'm going to go meet them. Well, it turns out like they were just two guys from Barcelona that happened to coach soccer. They weren't from FC Barcelona, right? When we lost, I remember like I got pulled out of a game and we were losing, and the coach like tried to criticize me, and I was like, dude, what the fuck are you criticizing me for? Like, we didn't do anything at practice for like 2 weeks and we just got smashed. That's not my responsibility. That's you, dude. Like, you're the coach. And I like this idea of like wake up, like this metaphor, right? Because I think American soccer is a sleeping giant. I think when we wake up, we're going to be a very, 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 very powerful nation when it comes to soccer, and it's going to be very, very hard to deal with us as a whole, because right now we're not a whole. Right now we are a fraction of what we can be.
John's the third interview that's come out of the college soccer / MLS versus USL doubleheader in mid-February here in Santa Barbara. And by the way, the other two aren't bad either. Tomas, Hilliard-Arce, and Chris Pontius of the LA Galaxy. Go back and listen to them. But John's someone who I first reached out to because I admired how he keeps it real about American soccer over in the 3four3 podcast. But this conversation, though admittedly very loosely structured and somewhat by design, is already one of my favorites because it's about that and so much more. Life, podcasting, beer, both Tomas and I just turned 21 2 weeks ago, and how to be close to somebody and still butcher their name every time you see them. So a special thanks again to John for chatting with me and giving me some podcasting advice that night, and now coming into the studio for this episode on his way down to LAX last Thursday. All right, I talk too much, and I don't think I can think of anything that would give this chat the introduction it deserves anyway. Well, this is all the time I'll get using one of the good mics this episode. You will understand what I mean once we get started with the interview, which comes your way right now. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Tomas and I are sharing a mic for the first time ever because of our exciting show today. We have an in-studio guest for the first time. John Pranjic, you're joining some pretty big names here. All right, we had first guest was Ishmael Jome of Minnesota United FC, former Gaucho. All of these are former Gauchos, actually. Chris Pontius. And Tomas Hilliard-Arce as well, a Stanford College Cup winner, right?
Tomas wasn't a Gaucho.
He
was a Cardinal.
Yeah, well, I was trying to remember who he had. And now John Pranjic. How about that?
I'm a Alan Hancock Bulldog. We're bringing the junior college flavor in here.
So, I don't think our podcast, we both talk soccer. We both talk it in very different capacities because we're covering what happens throughout the week and whatever is going on in the gossip world and, all that BS. But you cover some stories. You go in depth. So tell our listeners a little bit about who you are, what you do, what the 3four3 podcast is too.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So people, and I've been asked this question more so lately than ever before.
Well, that's good, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. If I consider myself part of soccer media or not. And for a long time, my answer was always no. Because I would always say I was a soccer coach, and I still think of myself as a soccer coach. I still think that's what I am and what I want to be. Mm. But now more than ever before, I am starting to kind of transition into being part of the soccer media and part of being a voice in the bigger picture where, the podcast has gained some traction in the last, 6 to 8 months. And the listeners have grown exponentially, which is really awesome to see. And I'm super thankful for it. But going back to the start of it, when I was just a coach, the reason why I started the podcast is because there was, to my knowledge, there was nothing of the sort. There was nothing that was talking about soccer coaching. There was a lot of people talking about scores and a lot of people talking about transfer rumors and talking about injuries. No, but I think that's, that's a good place to start. But when you think about like businesses or ideas that are successful, it's like, okay, well, soccer podcasts existed, right? Okay. So what didn't exist in soccer podcasting at the time was that niche of, talking about soccer coaching. Now, fast forward 3.5, 4 years, everybody has a podcast. And so that's why I've kind of had to reposition my show again, which we can get into later. But
do you feel like you somewhat inspired others into breaking into the coaching podcasting world?
It's weird to say yes, but yes, I do. And I don't want people to think that I'm trying to be arrogant or,
of course,
cocky. But yeah, I think, and I've talked about it with my boss quite a bit. We've spawned, many other things that are like our products. So like our coaching website or like our podcast or like our blog. So, and it's a great thing because people are starting to find their voice and they're starting to contribute to the conversation as well. And we need that. So, I don't think that I was the only soccer coaching podcast at that time. I think I was, in an isolated area where it wasn't prevalent. Right. So, I was able to reach out and find, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 people that liked what I was talking about. And then that grew and maybe 5 or 10 people started a show and now they have that audience. And so it's just grown and grown and grown. And I think that's an awesome thing. So, but yeah, it started about soccer coaching and I don't get to tell a story very often, which is pretty funny, but I was in a park in downtown LA. I was there to watch a soccer camp and, the camp was being put on by Danny Letterman, Ben Letterman's dad. So Ben Letterman is one of the few, I think maybe the first American to play at FC Barcelona. So Ben is part of their U17 or U18 team now. I can't remember exactly. And I don't remember what the Spanish level, they name all theirs a certain level. So I knew that camp was happening. I knew about Ben. I knew that there was going to be some coaches from Barcelona that were going to be there. I thought, when I was, I would have been like 24 or 25 when that happened or something. Right. I was thinking like, oh, these guys from FC Barcelona are going to be, at this park in downtown LA. I'm going to go meet them. Well, it turns out like they were just two guys from Barcelona that happened to coach soccer. They weren't from FC Barcelona. Right. But it was cool though, because there's another part to the story I can get into in a second, but they did train their teams in a different way. And I liked being able to see that. And that was something that I related more to than the American soccer coaching way of doing things. I didn't ascribe to the way, that U.S. soccer, ran its curriculum at the time. I think it was Claudia Reyna's document that went out in like 2010, and that became like the Bible for soccer coaches in America for quite a while. I didn't ascribe to that. I didn't like the American way of playing or doing things or thinking, so I ascribed to the Spanish way. And so getting to see like how these regular guys coached it, they just coached at a regular club in Barcelona. Come to find out, right? It was really cool to see that. And so when I was there and I was sitting in the park, I was like, I want to ask these guys questions, but I don't want to forget what they're going to say. I didn't have a notepad or anything. So I was like, all right, cool. Grab my phone. And I went up to him at the end of I went up to Danny first, the dad that was organizing everything. And I said, hey, Danny, like, can I ask these guys questions? And Danny's like, yeah, sure, go for it, whatever. And I was like, can I actually ask you a question first? And so I started recording my phone and I just put my phone in his face. And then started to, ask a question. I can't remember exactly what I asked him. Anyways, fast forward.
You still have that recording saved somewhere?
Yeah, somewhere. It was on SoundCloud for a while, and I think if I went back, I could find it. But yeah, that's where it started. Like I uploaded it to SoundCloud, and I asked the coaches like a handful of questions, and I think all said and done, it was probably like less than 10 minutes worth of content. Put it out there, and 50 people listened to it, and I was like, oh, cool. And then I was like, all right, well, I kind of liked having conversations with other coaches because I feel like we were on the same level. It's different than like a Grant Wall, for instance, right, who doesn't have any soccer playing experience or any soccer background. And he goes and he gets a chance to talk to Christian Pulisic, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, well, Grant, you've covered the game or whatever, but you've never played the game. You've never coached the game. So really you don't have anything where you can kind of be like peer to peer with Christian about. But I could with other coaches. And so that's my mentality was like, hey, like I'm not coming at this from a reporter standpoint or a media standpoint. I'm coming at this from a coaching standpoint. So like if I ever had the chance to sit down with, a Klopp or a Jurgen Klinsmann or, people like that, like, my conversation, and I call it a conversation, but my questions would be a lot different than I think what Grant Wall might ask. And I use Grant. I just like to pick on Grant, but nothing
I think
against the guy.
People like to pick on Grant.
Yeah, and you know what? It's part of the business, right? So if you guys get into this, you guys are gonna have to deal with that too. I have to deal with it. People call me, all sorts of stuff now that that my show's out there and it can be criticized. When you put yourself out in the open, you open yourself up to criticism and learning. It's funny to talk about because I'm not some huge star. I don't have a humongous following, but in the niche, there's niche followers and then there's niche haters. Right. So there's people that are there every single time that I put something out or that I tweet something or that, a blog post goes out. And there are people there every time that will critique it or criticize it or, give you their 2 cents. And learning to deal with that is interesting. It's very, very interesting. It's hard sometimes, but it's part of the journey. It's kind of fun. So.
And I'm trying to cycle through the podcast pages, but you were talking about how you've interviewed coaches, and that kind of gets your juices flowing. But in much the same way, you interviewed a player. I can't quite remember the name, but I listened to this podcast, and they were going out, and after their career, they're interviewing other players.
Tristan Bowen.
That's right, Tristan Bowen, formerly with the Galaxy.
The first ever MLS homegrown player.
Yes.
Which that's an interesting story. So anybody that wants to look into, the history of MLS homegrown players, and that is a increasingly interesting topic, especially when you get things like DeAndre Yedlin and the Crossfire, where his real club that produced him, and then Seattle Sounders came in and swooped him, and then you get into the idea of solidarity payments or training compensation and
the discovery thing.
So the interesting part of Tristan's story was he never played a game in LA Galaxy's academy. The academy at that time didn't even exist really because DAs were, brand new. Tristan got signed as like a 16 or some 17-year-old, something like that, and got signed right to the first team. But the way that they worked it was that they promoted him as, a Galaxy youth product. And so it was kind of like a fib, but not really because of the way that because of the way they wrote their homegrown rules. So it's just an interesting story about how that got positioned the way that it did. And then how Tristan's, story ended up playing out. And when I interviewed him, he wanted, he was really trying to get a shot, back in MLS, and he was shooting for LAFC. He wanted to be, he is from LA, so he is like homegrown LA, and he really wanted a chance to prove himself in LA where he's from. But it hasn't worked out for him yet. I don't think he's given up. But yeah, so now in his spare time, he's hosting a show too. So
yeah, no, that's awesome. And I'll get out of your way so you can ask a question, Thomas. But last comment on this too is I think that might also be the future of journalism, because you've got these players, and like you said yourself, as a coach interviewing other coaches, like these little homegrown independent podcasts and the Players Tribune. I think that's really highlighting that these players aren't just relegated to roles as analysts or color commentators on broadcasts. So I think that's positive for the future of players in media as well. But don't know what you got, Thomas.
Oh, I was
just comment there for a second.
I did. It was back on the criticism side of it, but moving forward, I kind of just want to pick your brain a little bit about coaching, because coaching is something that I've seen myself do. I played up until I was 14, I guess, and then I broke my leg pretty badly, like in 3 or 4 spots. Dude. And so I had to give up sports, but this is kind of like, I'm more on the journalism side of it. Like, I do the podcast, but I enjoy writing about sports. But coaching seemed like another avenue to kind of still be involved in sports. So if there's somebody who's trying to break into coaching, what would be the biggest piece of advice, or the first piece of advice that you would give them?
Trying to break into coaching.
Like finding a role as a coach or some sort.
Yeah. Well, I guess the reason why I got into coaching, so what kind of I say forced me into coaching, was I had a bad experience with my coaches. So when I was a player, I had a bad experience at my high school. I had a bad experience when I moved on to college. And so that's when I made the decision, like, hey, like, I don't want any other player to go through what I've gone through. So what can I do to, I don't want to say give back, because I'm not trying to give back, right? But
to right the ship, I guess.
Yeah, to just to make an impact in that type of way, right?
And can I ask you what kind of, if you don't mind answering, was it like tactical differences, or was it just like your coaches were just kind of
well, yeah. So I mean, tactics were non-existent.
Right.
We're talking like almost 15 years ago in American soccer. The tactical revolution, I guess you could say, didn't really happen until recently. Mm-hmm. So this idea of tactics didn't exist for a long time in American soccer, and on the macro level, I don't think that it is anywhere near where it needs to be, but I think you see or you hear more about it now than ever before. No, it was just an all around just bad experience. So in college, for instance, like this was the driving factor for me. The coach, for whatever reason, was like well respected in the community, but he would literally come to practice, drop the balls off, and then go talk to the AD for like an hour. And so we were sitting there like, all right, well, like, should we practice? And so me and my teammates, we'd be like, hey, like, all right, let's kick the ball or something. Like, and then so when we lost, I remember like I got pulled out of a game and we were losing, and the coach like tried to criticize me, and I was like, dude, what the fuck are you criticizing me for? Like, we didn't do anything at practice for like 2 weeks and we just got smashed. That's not my responsibility. That's you, dude. Like, you're the coach. And so just after like a terrible experience, I decided to go back to the high school that I graduated from, and I volunteered to assist. And so if you're looking for a way to get in, like, you can volunteer your time anywhere. Like, anybody, there's tons of organizations that want help. I volunteer for a recreational league in Santa Maria right now, and they want help. It's when you start to like get to that next level of coaching club or coaching college, where you need like you need that volunteer experience or those first experiences in coaching. And I think that volunteer experience will kind of help you decide like, hey, is this for me or is it not? Because when you get to the next level, like say you want to coach club, well, the reward for dedicating all your time to coaching club is not much more than working for free when you're volunteering. Right, so right. You have to kind of get used to this lifestyle, this very humble lifestyle, for many, many years. I'm 12 years into coaching youth soccer, and I don't think I've made it by any means, right?
Yeah, but you speak about how you need to be prepared to accept that reality on one of your podcasts.
Yeah, and you really do, and it's you could go a couple different ways with this. You could say that the reason why it's like that is because of the system that we have, right? Mm-hmm. So the system that we have encourages clubs to hire volunteers and work on a shoestring budget and things like that, just because that's the way that American soccer operates. Okay, I 100% believe that. So if the system was different and every club here in America had its own first team, well then I think people would be getting paid more. I think there'd be more revenue for every club, there'd be more money to go around all over, right? I wholeheartedly believe that. But you take that and you look at like what happens in Spain, for instance. So going back to those two guys that I met in the park in LA, I've been fortunate to actually go and watch them coach in Spain now. So I got a chance to go and meet them, which is a super funny story. But those guys are full-time coaches, and they work for big clubs. Clubs that they work, for instance, for Cornellà in Barcelona, which produced Jordi Alba, who's now at FC Barcelona, and many other players that are all over the world, right? But those guys work for pennies, man. Pennies. They work for way less than what we get paid here in America. And these guys are head and shoulders better than we are here. So it's like they are living an even more humble lifestyle than we are here. And here we are in America thinking like, oh man, we deserve, thousands and thousands of dollars in salaries and, nice cars for coaching and giving all of our time to youth soccer. It's like, and here these guys are developing the best players in the world for peanuts. And so it's a weird mentality, I guess, and that's a tangent, but
a culture shock in some ways.
It's a culture shock for sure. I mean, to get back to like your original question, like how do you get into it? I would say, you have to go find a place to dip your toes in the water. And a lot of times the easiest way to do that is to volunteer somewhere. And it can be, 5 to 10 hours a week. It could be with one team. It could be with an organization. It can be in a number of different ways. But I do think that that is the best way to do it. And I think that a lot of coaches have gone that route themselves. So I think you wouldn't be in bad company if you decided to go that route too. And that's kind of the proving ground as well. So it's like, hey, like you prove to yourself that I really want to do this. And then you prove to others that you can.
Capable.
Yeah. So that's really the first place. You can't walk into like a Real SoCal or,
of course.
unless you're Jermaine Jones.
Yeah, really.
And lifetime experience too. Come on now.
Or what's Santa Barbara Soccer Club. You can't just walk on the field and, hey, I want to coach. But you can be like, hey, I want to volunteer and I want to learn. And that would be, I think, an appropriate way to get your feet wet. So.
Yeah, that's kind of where you start with almost everything. Right?
Everything. I mean, the radio, whatever, right? It's like you kind of, you have to find a way to get your foot in the door and then kind of navigate from there.
Yeah. So to our regular listeners, there's usually some sort of structure to the podcast, but we're just going to be hopping around. And my next question is actually about the Champions League finals. So I want to ask you, and I kind of alluded to this before we talked, which I shouldn't have because it's not a surprise anymore.
No.
Although a responsible me would send you like some questions beforehand.
Not at all, man.
How much blame can Liverpool have on their goalkeeping coaches? Because Laura's curious, and I've heard this come up pretty often throughout the week. He has a tendency to parry shots back where they came from, creating rebounds, chances, all that. So, who do we blame for that? Do we blame the goalkeeper itself in the big game, or because he's been making mistakes all season long?
Yeah, it's hard. So when you look at it, when you zoom in on those moments, I think it's easy to blame the goalkeeper. I think that's an easy target, right? And I think everybody knows that. I think his teammates know that. I think his coach knows that. I think, every fan that watched the game knows that in that moment, it's very easy to blame him. When you start to zoom out and you start to look at, what did he do the last 5 games, or what did he do over the course of the season?
Well, what was he like when he came in and when he was highly touted as like one of the younger stars to become one of the next best goalkeepers, and then now? Yeah.
So, as a coach or as, a front office or as a team, however you want to describe it, right? So it's like if you see that this person is not, and I don't want to just pigeonhole it on Carius, but when you see that somebody's not performing consistently at a high level or not in line with the rest of the team, right? So you could argue that Liverpool is, at a certain level, and Carius might be, just below that. And so there's maybe like a disconnect where Real Madrid, everybody is gold stars, right? And at the highest level. So there's no drop off anywhere in Real Madrid's roster. That's why Real Madrid wins 3 Champions League titles in a row, right?
4 out of 5. Yeah.
4 out of 5. And so when you look at, maybe Carius is the hole in the roster. And the front office decided to not do anything about that. The coach decided to not do anything about that. And so they were left with, hey, Carius is the best option. Let's roll. Time to go. We have to put somebody in there. So he's the man. But you could go the other way too. And I saw people making this argument, like they wouldn't be there without him. So if they would have left the other guy in goal, I can't remember who it is. Yeah. So if they would have left him in goal, they might not even be in the Champions League final. He had never taken a team there before. So, why would they depend on that guy? And I could be speaking out of turn there. I don't know if I don't think he's ever been to a Champions League final, but no. And so it's like, so why would you depend on that guy? Carius is, was a far better option. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Like Carius got him there, and he did good throughout their Champions League campaign. I don't follow Liverpool closely or close enough to give him a player rating over the course of a season or something like that. But I do know that he performed in plenty of big games and big moments, and it was funny. I think it was Travis Clark who posted something. Travis runs Top Drawer Soccer, or helps run Top Drawer Soccer. I think it was Travis. I could be wrong. It could be somebody else. But said besides that one mistake, besides his first mistake, besides the one mistake, Carius has had a very, very good game. And then he made the second mistake. And so then he retweeted what he said and said, well, besides those 2 mistakes, Karius had a really, really good game. Cause he did, like he made some badass saves and you know, he had a decent game. So
you're not saving the bail bike. I don't put that on Karius.
No, not at all. And there's certain things, right, that you can't stop. Like, are you going to get mad? Oh, this thing's freaking me out now. I don't know what I'm.
It works.
Like, are you going to fault the goalkeeper for 90% of the goals that Messi scores? Like, no, Messi's a freak, right? Do you fault the goalkeeper for the bicycle kick that Bale hit? No, that was a freak moment.
Right.
Like, there's nothing that people can do about those. Can you fault him for the one that he basically threw in the back of the goal? Yeah, you can put some blame on him, but I think
you should.
Yeah, and I think you should. And I think what makes maybe Klopp or a Mourinho or a Pep or anybody like a top manager, and you can relate it to other sports too. Popovich in NBA or Bill Belichick in NFL, whatever. I don't know enough about those guys to speak on them actually. But I think what makes somebody...
You named 2 good ones.
Yeah.
Not that much.
But, and they both have a similar bloodline to me, so that's why. But when you...
Croatian?
Belichick is, okay. And I think Popovich is too. But I think what makes somebody a top level manager is how you manage your players in that moment, right? So it's like what
that's what Chris Pontius said when we interviewed him as well. His best managers have been the best man managers.
Yeah, and so I think that Zidane is a good example of that. Like he wasn't touted as like this tactical genius.
No, he
was always kind of referred to as like this guy that knew how to put out fires and knew how to manage the personalities in the locker room, knew how to get somehow, the best out of Ronaldo and the best out of Bale in the situations that he needed to get the best out of them. Champions League final being one of them, right?
Right.
So I think, the more important, part of that Karius situation, I think for me, is seeing, how Klopp might manage it and how Karius might, move to the next season and what those guys are going to take from it and how Liverpool as an organization reacts to, hey, we finished second in Champions League and whatever they finished in Premier League. Like, how do we move forward from now? Mm-hmm. So I think those are interesting things to keep an eye on.
More so than just focusing on one goalkeeper.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to focus on mistakes, like this is what I always think about because I referee soccer too, right?
Right.
And people come up and want to complain about a phone or not a phone call, but about a foul like called or whatever. It's like, hey man, like, I'm not at your office, 7 days a week, every time you make a typo and you hit backspace. Like I'm not there critiquing every single thing that you do, right? But that's what we are able to do in the soccer world. Like we watch these games from thousands of miles away and we're able to give our opinions like they matter. And I think about this all the time, like, I don't fucking matter, dude. Like, Karius doesn't care what I say, right? But I think that I'm able to, like, give my opinions and, it just doesn't matter, I guess, is what I'm going for. And everybody's going to have their own opinion, but I think the more interesting thing to watch instead of people's opinions about these situations are the reactions or the actions of the club, of the manager, of the player moving forward. Because I think those are the real learning moments. You're not going to get anything from, hearing me, talk about Karius's form. So.
Let's take a break from the soccer discussion. What's the worst someone's ever butchered your name? I was kind of just thinking about.
Dude, good question.
Is it really?
Yeah, it's funny because there's somebody that's been a big part of my upbringing, for almost 20 years now, and he's never said my name correctly. So, and every time it's different. So it's so funny. Like when he introduces me to somebody at a meeting, he's been a referee mentor for me. And, he'll introduce me at a meeting or I don't know. He likes to say my last name. Like he'll call me by my last name, but get it wrong. So it's like, he calls me, Pranjic. And Pranjic.
That's not even close.
And no, he's throwing in letters that like don't even exist in there. And so it wasn't until he listened to an episode of my podcast where because I announced myself like, hi, my name is John Pranjic. Welcome to the 3four3 podcast, whatever I say. And he's like, I think he might have texted me or maybe I talked to him on the phone after. I can't remember exactly.
that's how you say
He's like, hey, like, I never knew how to pronounce your name. You never corrected me. I'm like, yeah, well, I've been dealing with my whole life. Like, every time I had a substitute teacher, it was like the worst.
You're literally the Key and Peele skit.
Yeah, no, it's so funny. But it was hilarious because there's this one time I remember in high school, and I used to ditch class all the time in high school. I was the worst student ever. But there was
That's how I feel now.
yeah. But I remember it was second period, like, I think I had marriage and family my senior year. And so it was like second semester. Huh?
That was a class.
It was a class. Yeah. It was an elective. Yeah. Those are the types of classes I was taking.
I wish we had like a video.
Yeah. Right.
Look at our reactions.
So it was second period, marriage and family. I hardly ever went. Like, my friends joke that, they would see me walk by and I would just, like, they thought I was coming to class that day. I would just walk right by the door and just, like, go somewhere else. But so whatever reason, I went to class that day and we had a substitute teacher. And so he's calling off everybody's names. And I sat in the back. I wasn't really paying attention. I was messing around or something. And then he says my name. And he said, John Pranjic. I'm like, what? Like, yeah, like, I'm right here. Like, how'd you get my name right? He's like, I'm Croatian too. I'm like, oh, all right, cool. Like, it makes sense. So yeah, that's a funny story. I haven't thought about that in a long time. So
yeah, that's good. I actually am guilty. I think it had been a while after we had chatted at the game between the Galaxy and the Ventura County Fusion and the UCSB, that whole thing that we had here at Carter Stadium. It's been a while already since that. But then I went on the podcast a few days later because I had heard, like, your last episode, like, probably a week before that. And then I was like, at the end, we'll have Chris Pontius on, Tomas Hilliard-Arce on, and John Pranjic. I'll get it right.
And then there was like a 7 or 8 second, like, pause where we thought about, like, we'll just edit it out and we'll be fine.
Yeah, that should be like the title of most of our episodes. We'll edit it out. There's always something. Yeah. But in the spirit of how you don't edit stuff out in yours, I'll make sure to be light.
No, but it's to get into, like, the like a podcasting thing. So, it's not that I don't ever edit things out. It's, I prefer not to. And so what I always tell guests, and I've only had a small handful of people ever request an edit, but I let guests on the show not control the final, not the final outcome, but I give them, an opportunity to say, hey, like, I don't like what I said there, or, hey, like, I can't talk about that, so can you please edit that out? So the guest does have a little bit of control over the editing. And so the whole no editing thing actually stemmed from, I didn't know how to edit. And I didn't want to learn. So I was literally recording a conversation on my phone. Like, I don't know how to edit. So I would just put it all out there. Right. And then I started to kind of learn, and now I'm super comfortable with it. But yeah, there's only been a handful of people that have ever requested it. And I tell people, ahead of time, hey, I prefer not to edit. Now I even go as far as, like, you can hear the ringing of the phone call when I'm calling certain guests. Yeah. And so, like, you hear the start to finish. And I don't know a lot of these people that I'm interviewing. Like, for instance, the episode that went out today, it's with a guy in the United States Air Force. He's stationed somewhere in Southwest Asia. I was going to ask about that. And yeah, I'd never, ever talked to him before besides a couple Instagram DMs. And yeah, so I knew nothing about it. I didn't know what his voice sounded like. I didn't know if he was going to be terrible. I didn't know if he even had a cool story. And thankfully it worked out. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, I'm glad it did. I can imagine your first couple of episodes, you call someone up and then you do the whole interview. They're like, hey, by the way, can you take that out? And you're like, I don't know how. I'm sorry, man.
Yeah, I
have to find someone else.
You can give it a shot.
Yeah,
I'll send you the file. Yeah.
I can't remember, but I'm sure that something like that happened, for sure. I've done it too.
Where you're just, like, forced to learn.
No, and I'm actually going to ask and see if I can get this recording from you guys, because and I want to tell this story on air because I think it's important, for full transparency.
Well, you're still live on Periscope too.
Yeah, for sure. Well, there's not very many people watching now.
Yeah, high followers.
But I've done interviews where I've asked for edits, and I think that it's difficult for me sometimes when I get flipped to this side of it, right? Because I'm not necessarily comfortable with talking about my message because I'm not, in the routine. When people make the rounds in podcasting, right? So, like, you see the same guests on Tim Ferriss as you do on Gary Vaynerchuk, as you do on so-and-so show. Like, you see the people make the rounds, right? And Joe Rogan's another one. And those people are very comfortable with their message and answering the same types of questions, and they're very secure. And when I get flipped onto this side of it, I'm usually not. And so when somebody asks a question and I don't have the best answer, I don't want to say I'm insecure. It's just I sound like an idiot. And I'm like, can you edit that out? And I've even gone as far as having a terrible conversation with somebody where I agreed to be interviewed by this person for the wrong reasons, because him and I basically just had an argument for an hour.
Wow.
And I let him record it. And so afterwards I was like, hey man, like, I don't think that's good. That's going to look good for either of us. I would prefer, that it doesn't even go out, because I think me especially, but I think both of us, there's no benefit to people seeing it or listening to us argue. And I don't think that anybody's going to be interested in that. We don't, at the time, especially him and I didn't really have huge followings, and to put out a piece of content like that, I think would have just been a black mark on our resumes. Right. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, it's tough with how everything with the internet now, everything that you put out there is permanent.
Mm-hmm.
Like somebody will have it, and there are people out there. I call them trolls. Like they
all do. I'm one of them.
Their whole purpose is just to bring you down, and
yep.
so one bad thing that you put out there, it could ruin you, and it's definitely tough. I remember when we interviewed Chris Pontius, he said that the best interviews are the ones that make you a little bit uncomfortable, but not to the point where you're like, I don't want this out there. I just had never consciously thought about talking about this in that fashion before, and it's definitely interesting. I don't really like being on either side of it. I like being behind the keyboard typing away, but it's interesting.
Well, we can switch spots.
I think one of the other things that has maybe led to the little bit of success that I've had with podcasting is that every time that I interview somebody or I ask questions, I'm genuinely curious about learning that person's perspective. And so somebody mentioned a while back, like, how do I get the guests that I get? It's like, it's not that I get them, it's that I go after them and I ask certain people to be on my show. And so,
hell, that was one of my questions to you. Remember?
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think so. Number one is that I think most people would be surprised at how accessible a certain level of people are. I think more people are willing to do things like this, like come on podcasts or accept phone calls or exchange emails, than the everyday layman would anticipate. Right. So that's one thing. So I've never been afraid to go after, a Rocco Camiso, for instance, right? Like this guy that's a billionaire, owns the New York Cosmos. Like, I'm not afraid to go after him. Am I afraid to have a conversation with him? Yeah, it's intimidating for sure. But the other thing is that I as a podcaster, that's not beholden to, a network like ESPN or whatever, right? I get to choose who I interview. And so I choose people, and I've always chosen people that I'm interested in learning about. So this guy, Curtis Jones, for instance, the guy that I interviewed today or released today, he's not a big name. Nobody in the soccer world knows who he is, but he has a cool story and I wanted to tell it, and I wanted to help the world hear about it. And so I think that that's important. And when you're genuinely curious about something, you ask better questions and right. You ask better follow-up questions, and you lead the interview into more interesting pathways than a Grant Wall, to pick on Grant Wall again. Right. but it's like, so like a Grant will come into an interview with probably 60 questions written down already. Because he's not genuinely curious about what, the follow-up answers could potentially be, or the conversation could possibly go into. So he wants everything pre-planned. And so that's why I kind of critique people that do written interviews still. It's like, who the fuck is doing written interviews? It's 2018. Like, if you have the ability to ask people questions, release it, like, show it. And I think it gives, I think there's an inauthentic aspect to like some of these, written interviews on Planet Football or what's the other guy's name? I always forget his name. I don't know why I always forget his name. It's so distinct. Nipun Chopra. I mean, what he does, it's like he does like a lot of written or transcribed stuff. and I'm just like, why? Like why? It's so boring that you guys, you know, just pick and choose the answers or the questions that you guys want to put out there. And like, there's no flow to the conversation. It's not real. It's not authentic. And that's how I feel. I don't know.
Well, I think then again, to be fair to people like Grant, you know, I've come into all the interviews I've done with, you know, 14, 15 questions written down at least. And
I used to do that too.
It's not that I jump from every one to another, but if there's a follow-up that I can ask, then I'll ask it.
Yeah.
And I think that any good interviewer, and Grant's got access and he's gotten a lot of guests on, that doesn't come without at least being some semblance of a good interviewer.
Yep.
So I will defend him in that right, and that if there's a follow-up question, I'm sure he might find an opening to ask it, but then again, you might know something I don't. So
no, it's not that I know something that anybody doesn't. But I think I guess a good way to put it is like when you watch a master question asker,
right,
or when you watch like a master interviewer or a master of anything, right? It's like that's who you want to be learning from. So I would consider, you know, a great example of an interviewer as being Joe Rogan. You know, very conversational style. I've never seen notes in front of Joe Rogan. And so it wasn't until I started to listen to Joe Rogan, because I didn't think of him as you know, a possible mentor for me, or a possible you know, teacher for me, which I had to, you know, step back and think like, you know, who am I learning from when I'm putting these podcasts out? Like who are my podcast role models? And so Joe Rogan became one. So it's like, I love the way that he does that, just free flowing conversation. That's how I've kind of graduated to the types of conversations that I'm having now, where, you know, do I research guests? Absolutely.
You have to.
Do I, you know, have an idea of what I want to get out of them? Absolutely. But I don't let that dictate the way that the conversation goes. And so when I used to do, you know, plan out, you know, a whole shitload of questions, right? It took me a while to realize, like, I only got to 4 of these questions. Yeah. You know, and then an hour went by, and why did I waste my time writing down all these other questions, right? So it was really interesting for me to do that. And there's one that stands out in my mind when I interviewed Dennis Crowley. I had help.
Oh, the Foursquare founder?
Yeah, so I had help. So this guy that I used to coach, his name's Ian. I like hired Ian. Ian's my go-to guy. And I was like, Ian, like, help me research and get ready for this interview. So we came up with like a boatload of questions. I can share the Google Doc with you and show you like how I used to structure it. I used to come up with like, you know, 5 possible episode titles and all kinds of stuff before the interview. Before the interview, yeah.
Well, because you're pretty creative in your episode titles. I will give you that. Like, Adam Finney crushes every excuse and delivers a proper soccer experience to his players. You can too. I like that.
Yeah. So, and that comes from, you know, me learning from the owner of the company that I worked for, Gary Kleiben. So the owner of 3four3, or co-founder of 3four3.
Tell him to get us shirts.
Yeah, I know. Huh? I need to get myself a shirt. And so we base all of our work, or our body of work, off of, you know, some of our role models as well, or he has a role model that has now become a role model of mine in copywriting and content creation. So we learn a lot from them, and we take that and we apply that to soccer. So the way that they do education, or the way that they do content marketing, or the way that they do product creation, or whatever, right? So we take that and we put our soccer brains to that. And yeah, so headline writing is, dude, it's an art. And I'm not good at it, and I have to remind myself to go back and you know, retry to or relearn it. And I do that probably once every 3 or 4 months now, where it's like I get in this kind of rut, and I'm like, I go back and I read certain articles, or I read good examples of headlines, and you know, why they are good. I remind myself of why those are good. Like the Adam one. Mm-hmm. I think, yeah, I'll pat myself on the back for that. I think that was a pretty good one. And I forget where I was going with that, but yeah.
Well, I think we learned from you, because what's our headlines? Usually some stupid shit we say during the podcast, right? Big Baller Bakayoko was one, yeah?
Some dumb shit that comes up that we laugh at for a little bit. But
an inside joke.
I'm still struggling with it, because I have to make my own headlines because I write for Fansided, and so I have to come up with my own headlines and that kind of stuff. And I'll sit there, and that'll take almost as long as like me putting the article out, like writing what I want to say. Because I'm sitting, I'm thinking, and then I try to put myself in like the reader's shoes. I'm like, all right, what would I click on? Not that I want it to be clickbait, but what would interest somebody enough to click on it? And it's funny to like think about, because prior to actually doing it, you never think about how much work actually goes into something as simple as a headline.
When you get to a certain level in you know, businesses like Fortune 500s or whatever, they hire people just for that. So that is somebody's standalone job, is to write headlines, not articles, headlines. And, you know, to think that, you know, people make a living off of doing something like that is insane, right? That's how important it is to like a Fortune 500 company, you know, somebody that wants to sell you a medication or, you know, a product or whatever. It could be anything, right? But the headline is that important that they will hire somebody, and that is their full-time job, to write headlines. It's insane. But when you start to learn about it and you start to practice it, right, you start to understand, like, you know, and you start to appreciate, I think, and I go back to this too.
Good word.
And so when I used to work in the beer industry, I worked for
I got questions.
Yeah.
This is my turn. I saw the shirt.
And this is an interesting story I've never told either. But so when I worked in the beer industry, I worked for a company that did sour beers or wild fermentation beers, right? And so that's not something that the average everyday beer drinker is into, right? And so a lot of people have to, you know, get exposed to that for the first time, or a lot of people are getting exposed to that for the first time when they go into a sour brewery or a wild fermentation brewery. And so when I was explaining it to customers, like, you know, the first part of liking a sour beer is appreciating it, because a lot of times people will take a taste and they're like, oh man, like that's terrible. Like, what is that? It tastes like vinegar. Oh, it's sour. Like, oh, it tastes like a warhead. And they can't get past that part of it, right? But it's because they don't appreciate the process, and they don't appreciate that that's what the brewer was actually trying to get to. So what the brewer, you know, the steps the brewer took to get that to taste like it actually does in your glass, when you can appreciate that process, then you can start to appreciate, you know, the flavors and the complexity behind it, and you can start to understand it, and then you can like it. But you're usually not going to like something right out of the bat. So, and I think that kind of transitions good into like headline writing. So it's like when you can appreciate, you know, what goes into the headline writing, then you understand, like, dude, like this is an art form. So,
and it's something else that has popped up for me. I'm writing stuff a little bit more formulaic than what you're writing for Fansided per se, not as many opinion pieces, but I interned for the athletics department here at UCSB and write some of the headlines for their website for baseball and softball this past season. And there's a couple times when I'm like, oh, we've used walk-off like 3 times already this season. Let's make it a little bit more exciting. Let's add a little bit of flavor to it, you know. Let's add sensational in the headline. So it's stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I feel like that plays into that.
Yeah, and I added a battle that with this morning's headline. So it's like, I think I started like, hear Curtis Jones talk about blah, 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 right? And so it's like, how often have I used the word hear? How often do I say listen? How often do I, you know, things like that. So I'm conscious of it. But sometimes it's like, that's just it just sounds right. So I roll with it. And, you know, is it the best? Probably not. But I like to think that it's better than a lot of stuff that's out there. So
we caught you on your way to LAX at 7:12. We got about what, 10 minutes?
Yeah, whatever.
Okay,
we're flowing.
So late.
Yeah,
you're like, oh, I'm never coming back. But
I want to make sure I answer all your guys' questions though. So if there's stuff that we're not getting to, we can.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. Hopefully we'll have you back. You know, sometime in fall, or you know, we can do a phone interview, whatever works. You know, and we've done plenty.
I kind of just, if you're down, I kind of want to just do it doesn't have to be long, but a craft beer podcast.
We both turned 21 just this past week.
Shoot the shit about
the past week.
Beer. Yeah.
Oh.
He was last Thursday. I was last Friday.
And you're already wearing a beer shirt.
Yeah. Don't ask any more questions about that. No, but my dad got me into craft beer, and so,
last week, right?
Yeah. Okay. Last Friday to be exact. And so I think it'd be fun to just talk about that for a while. Aside from.
So I've only been interviewed a handful of times, especially, you know, even a smaller amount that have actually went out. And one of the first interviews that I did where I was on this side of it was with Christopher Kramer, who's a coach. He lives in Oregon. Chris was my first official guest on my podcast, like when I did like an actual, you know, microphone, or actually, no, I didn't have a microphone then. But
I've always admired your setup.
Yeah. So Chris and I, when Chris started his podcast, we flipped roles, and so I was Chris's first guest for his show, and we spent a lot of time talking about beer and the similarities of problems that exist in the beer industry versus the soccer world, right? And so it's like you have the big beer network that is becoming more and more consolidated by the week, right? So they're buying all these small microbreweries all over the country. Yeah. Budweiser is now, I think, they're part of a bigger conglomerate out of Germany. And then you have Miller Coors, who, that's two big hitters that merge into one. So they basically, those three breweries control the entire market. And so they're buying all these other little microbreweries. Okay, who does that remind you of? Major League Soccer. So when you think, and so when you think about it, so here's like this big industry, right? Or this or Big Brother, and they see little brother, FC Cincinnati, like, hey, Cincinnati, like, we like what you're doing. Come play with us. And then they go and they buy you, or they get you to buy in, actually, which is so weird. So when you think about it from that aspect, I guess MLS is making people pay them money to join their club, but Budweiser is doing the opposite. Like Budweiser buys St. Archer. I think it was Budweiser that bought St. Archer, and Budweiser pays St. Archer $50 million so that way they get all their stuff. It's so backwards. MLS is so backwards. I don't understand it. But yeah, so it's like we could talk beer and soccer and go back and forth with stories like that, for multiple episodes.
That'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, I'm crossing out my FC Cincinnati question. No, well, here's my take on it, and we can give like a quick, like, I don't know, one sentence.
No, go for it.
Two more questions outside of this. So
remember, you don't have to hit all your questions.
But it's on there, and I didn't want. I literally had like 3 questions coming in, and then I was gonna develop the rest of it organically based on what I know about you, what I've heard, and all that. So
I like the banter.
Yeah. Tune in. Yeah. One more listener right here. So I think with FC Cincinnati going up to MLS, they had pretty good attendance in the USL. I think we're going to see how weak this quote unquote second division is once they go up, and how poorly attended and supported a lot of these USL teams are. And that's something, because it's them and SAC, and then what else draws any semblance of a large amount of fans?
It's a good question, and I think people,
not as much a question as a comment, to be
good topic, I guess, is the way to put it. I'm not as well versed in USL and lower division soccer as I probably should be, but I also don't have any really incentive to invest time into learning about things like the FC Cincinnati culture. Like what am I going to benefit from learning more about them? Not much. Right. So I do agree that we will see the level difference when FC Cincinnati joins Major League Soccer. You saw it with Minnesota United.
Yeah.
And you saw that when you get a chance to build something from scratch, and you get the protections and the gifts from Major League Soccer, like an LAFC, for instance, or an Atlanta United, well, that's a different ball game, right? So it's you're creating something out of thin air, and MLS has given you the perfect runway with every incentive and every perfect scenario that you can think of to start your team. But when you have FC Cincinnati already existing, well, these guys now have to make all sorts of decisions. What do I do with my front office? Do I keep everybody that's been with us along the whole way, or do I hire a new GM, a new president? Do I restructure? Do I downsize? Do I upsize? And then you look at the coaching staff. Hey, like, we're going from USL to Major League Soccer now. Like, this is going to be a jump, right? Do I keep the same coach? The coach has been with us the entire way. Okay, well, he's only gotten you to like what place in USL? Like, I don't think Cincinnati's even come close to the finals.
US
right?
Open Cup run at least, though. That
was the semifinals, right?
I believe so.
Yeah, so very cool. Yeah. Congratulations,
but
right?
Then again, the MLS teams in the Open Cup don't play their full strength roster. So you're basically playing other USL or similar teams.
Yeah.
Don't remind me, that was the emergence of Andrew Tarbell for the Quakes. Don't bring that up.
And that's another talking point, right? So how strong is the roster? So this roster that's been with you, I'm sure there's guys that have been there for 2, 3, 4 years, been part of your family, right? Hey, are they going to cut it? How do you cut ties with them? How do you tell them, like, hey man, like, thanks, but no thanks. So these are all interesting questions that FC Cincinnati or that Minnesota United
but with
had
that
to go
failure
through.
of Minnesota United, like you alluded to earlier.
Yeah,
there's going to be more changes than we saw.
Yeah, so expansion in that way is much different than expansion in the LAFC way. So it's two completely different scenarios that I think, not enough people step back and try to evaluate it from that perspective, right? So it's like when you have somebody that's being given mountains of cash and you can build your roster from scratch versus, you have this existing pool and you have to just restructure it to fit into this new wheel. It's interesting and different, I think, is the best way that I can describe it, because I'm not a pro at it.
It bugs me to no end. I'm from Sacramento, so I've been a fan of Sac Republic since they began, and it bugs me to no end that we're seeing teams like Miami pop up now and Cincinnati that. I don't understand what Cincinnati has that Sacramento doesn't.
Since he had very good fan support and investors. Miami, on the other hand,
Sacramento set the record for USL attendance.
Well,
2 consecutive seasons prior to last
University
year.
of Cincinnati.
But then now they're making a stadium that's less than their average attendance. They're making a 21,000 seat stadium, which is considerably less than average
Supply and
attendance.
demand.
Makes
Supply and
no
demand,
sense.
brother. The average attendance has been like 27,000.
Well, who do you think's lowering their bar?
MLS.
I think so.
Yeah.
But this is just speculation at this point. But it's like MLS knows the trend, right? So MLS knows the trend that it's going to be very hard for anybody to become another Seattle in their structure, right? So in the MLS structure, it's going to be very hard for Cincinnati to continue to do what they've done. Yeah. That flame is eventually going to burn out. I think who I mentioned to you earlier when we were walking over here, Kartik. Kartik wrote an article saying there's going to be a point of diminishing returns or something like that.
Yeah, same for Atlanta. We'll see in the next couple.
No, for sure. Like the flame will burn out in this system. You see it with Columbus. You see it with New England. You've seen it with DC United, right? And
San Jose in an 18,000 person soccer specific stadium. That's now the smallest SSS in MLS.
Yeah.
They can't even sell out anymore.
No, exactly.
Because it's a bad product, first of all.
Yeah, and so the product is bad, right? And so but the product is not what dictates your involvement in the league. It's not your product. It's how fancy are your jerseys, or what's your relationship like with the other owners, or how much is your net worth?
Who's your biggest investor?
What's the population of your city? Like those are the things that matter more than providing a good product. And so to go back to your comments about you're frustrated, you should be frustrated. And I was thinking about this on the way over here that more people need to be frustrated, but in order for more people to be frustrated, I think it sounds weird to say it, right? But more people need to get mad about this in a good way. But in order for them to get mad or to get frustrated or, to have any type of feeling about it, they need to be educated about it. And so they need to start to understand, why things are the way that they are. Not saying you need to learn the history of it, but it's you need to understand, the day-to-day workings of, why is Cincinnati being chosen over Sacramento, or why does anybody get chosen to be in MLS? Why do they not earn their way in like they do in the Premier League, like Leicester did, or yeah. And so more people need to be educated, and I hate saying this word because it has such negative connotation. It's almost used as like a slur these days, especially with the political atmosphere and whatever. But American soccer fans are ignorant. And they just don't know what they don't know. And when people wake up and they start to learn about why things are the way that they are, then they get frustrated, and then they start to talk about it with their friends, and that educates more people and more people and more people. So that's I thought we were closer to that tipping point when it came close to the election.
Right. And you interviewed Winalda twice.
Yeah, and then I realized, as we were getting closer and closer to the election, that we're actually in the baby steps of this education phase for the United States. There's there's people that have been in the game for years and years and years, decades, right? And they're part of the problem. They need to be educated too, and guys make fun of it, like Alexi makes fun of people that say burn it all down or whatever. It's I don't think that a burn it all down mentality is correct. I think that the people that are involved need education, and they need to be willing to change with us. Mm-hmm. And they need to realize hey, I've been part of the problem for this amount of years, and I just didn't know any better. Like, hey, like this is how things were just run, and I've went along with how it's been run, and now I realize that they should be run differently, and that's okay. Like, hey, things change with us. Like let's make a change for the better, and wake up together. And I like this idea of like wake up, like this metaphor, right? Because I think American soccer is a sleeping giant. I think when we wake up, we're going to be a very, 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 very powerful nation when it comes to soccer. And it's going to be very, very hard to deal with us as a whole, because right now we're not a whole. Right now we are a fraction of what we can be. Our potential is a fraction of what we could be because of the system that's in place. And I think when people start to learn about, how that affects them on a micro level, not just on a macro level, but, how this system affects their community, their local club, their kid, their opportunities as a coach. When they start to realize that, it's the decisions that are at the top that are being made that are affecting them down here, and they start to educate themselves or learn, I think that's when we're going to see a real tipping point. And now I think we're barely starting to scratch that.
But our national team slogan is "One Nation, One Team." #United 2026. John, why are you not listening?
I know, man.
No, but in reality, I don't think it's burn it all down. I think it's a transition. And you're not just gonna institute pro rel overnight or anything. No, because then you're gonna kill a bunch of clubs in USL or below.
But here's what we've always said is that the longer we wait to announce a start date, the longer it is before we see progress. So it's like, I think, most of the people that are pro rel advocates understand, like, hey, like, yeah, this can't happen tomorrow. It can't happen next year.
But we're all calling each other stupid.
Yeah. But if we say, hey guys, or if US Soccer said, hey, American soccer fans, we are going to institute promotion relegation in 2028. Perfect. Give everybody a 10-year runway, like Rocco's asking for with his deal, right? Give everybody a 10-year runway. Give all these MLS guys a 10-year head start. They've already had 22 years as a head start. Give them 10 more years to get all their ducks in a row. And then in 2028, it's going to happen. But the longer we wait, so like we could have said that in 2014. We could have said that in 2010. We could have said that in 2006.
Could have said that the night after Trinidad.
Yeah, we could have. Yeah. So, but the longer we wait to say it, the longer our progress is going to take. And so if we wait until 2028 to say, hey guys, in 2038, we're going to do this. Well, 2038, like that's 20 more years before we see, any type of, one nation, one, whatever the slogan is, really take effect. Right. Because right now that's not going to take effect by 2026. It won't. It won't take effect by 2022. Unless we really do include the entire nation in the soccer landscape. That's just how I feel. I don't know.
Right. Well, one last question before I get you on the road. John Pranjic in studio for the first time ever. How is it? How was your first time?
I like it, man. It's more comfortable.
Yeah, right. Because you don't have to like wait and you're on the phone. And sometimes you're talking over each other when you're on the phone. And it's like, oh no, you can go ahead.
Yeah,
we've had that a lot, and I've had to edit that out. But no, hope to have you back at some point. And it looks like the 3four3 podcast. Now I'm plugging you now, so that goes for you. It looks like you've been able to tap into some serious stories and talk to some pretty serious people along the way. So yeah, I feel it's done a lot for you personally as well. So how do you kind of encapsulate that? Is it kind of like almost in a way spiritual for you? Like, I don't know, because just doing the podcast here with us, it's very nice to be able to just kind of break out of the routine for at least an hour or two every week and just talk sports, but for you, it's trying to pursue something.
Yeah, it's, I can say one thing for sure. I don't hate my voice anymore. I think anybody that gets into video or audio, it's like when you first hear yourself, or people will think back with the first time they recorded themselves as a kid and they hear their voice on the TV, right? When the parents pop in the VHS, you hear your voice. That's not me. Like, no, that's not me. But no,
I don't listen to my freshman year play.
So I've come to terms with, maybe I do have a voice for radio. I don't have a face for video. So, but as far as it being, like spiritual or anything like that.
Maybe I'm reading it too.
No. I like the angle though. I think it used to be an escape when I was working in the beer world, when I had, my day job. Now that this has become my job, this is my full-time job now, it's a little different. So now I feel the stresses and I feel the pressures differently than I did last year when I had, a steady paycheck coming in from an outside source, where this was the hobby and now the hobby's become the job. So it's really weird when you hear people say like, do what you love, or, yeah, but when you do what you love, then it becomes fucking stressful. Like, then you have to, then your love, like if you love, I can't even think of a good example, something, if you love yoga, for instance, right? Okay. So
could have chosen something better. You got two guys in the room.
Yeah. Well, but if you love yoga, okay. So you're going to start a yoga business, right? So what happens when you start a yoga business? Well, then you have to learn how to do QuickBooks, and then you have to learn how to, set up payment processing. And then you have to learn how to start get a business license.
Right.
And those are things that come along with doing what you love. Right. And those are hard. Yeah. Those are hard things to do. And so, but I think if I can end on one thing, it's like if you decide to do something, right? So like I consciously decided to make this my full-time gig, right? So then it's up to me to own it. And it's up to me to, if I'm responsible for producing 2 to 3 podcasts per week, okay, I have to do that. It's my responsibility to get that out to everybody. And then it's up to me to frame how I want to view that, or to let that be part of my life. I can look at it as a negative, or I can look at it as a positive. I chose it, so now I choose to be positive about it. So it's kind of my mindset.
It's a great spot to end. So for Thomas and myself, have fun in Austin. You're on your way there, right? So enjoy that. And catch us on Football versus Football, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher. You can catch John's podcast at 3four3coaching.com/podcast. Correct?
Yep.
Good. I was just staring at it for an hour. So. All right. Thanks a ton. Hopefully we can catch back up soon. And see you all later.